Right. Hello again, everybody. I hope we're doing well. Today, it should be one of the last installments on the segment of the course on ethics, and especially the section of the course on sort of ethics on the fringes. So today, we're going to be thinking about specifically the interests or the ethics of plants, right? So, um, when you destroy a plant, are you doing something wrong? Is there something that you have to think about in order to do that and it be morally permissible, right? And so Ronald Sandler is posing this question for us, and so he wants to talk about first of all the conception of inherent worth. So to say that something has inherent worth is to make two claims about that thing. And this is following Taylor, 1986, who's a super famous environmental ethicist, one of those touchstone um, uh, environmental ethicist people. But there are two claims that's wrapped up in this. Is one, the thing has interests or a good of its own, right? So that means that this thing, things can go better or worse for it, right? So, for example, a human being, right? If you don't feed a human being, the human being tends to not do quite as well as when it has plenty of food, right? Okay, and so we would say that human beings, they have interests and they have a good of their own, right? And two, moral agents should care about those interests for the object or for its own sake, right? So, for example, a human being, right? Not only does it have interests, not only does he or she have interests, right? But we should care about whether or not that person has their interests met, right? So if something has both of these things, then it has inherent worth, at least according to Taylor. So if something has inherent worth, that is both an axiological claim, a claim about what is good for something, and an ethical claim about what we should do. There's normative guidance wrapped up in inherent worth in this conception of inherent worth. Okay, and then here is a quote differentiating between two notions of interest, right? So to say that X has an interest in Y, right? So fill in the blanks. A human has an interest in food. An oak has an interest in sunlight, blah, 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 can mean two different things. X is interested in Y, or Y is in X's interest, right? So, for example, it doesn't make sense to say that an oak tree is interested in sunlight, right? That means that the oak tree has some kind of mental capacity or mental function, right? And some people argue this, but most people don't. Is that an oak tree doesn't have consciousness; it doesn't have a brain, right? And so that means that we have to use this second sense of interest, right? And so it's to say that sunlight is in an oak tree's interest. That is, without sunlight, the oak tree is going to, say, fare worse, right? It's going to be more worse off than if the tree does have sunlight, right? And so that's the sense we can distinguish between consciously held interests and non-consciously held interests, right? So a human being has consciously held interest. We think about food, we think about shelter, we think about the things that are in our interest. Oak trees, for example, do not think about their interests. Yet we can still call them interests, plausibly so. Okay, so so well-being and welfare are more than just psychological states, right? So we could have a person that has a horrible cancer, right? But is just super happy, right? Maybe this is before the cancer is diagnosed. We would say, we wouldn't say that that person has like a very high amount of welfare, even though they have wonderful psychological states, right? And this is because welfare is largely a biological and not necessarily a psychological phenomenon, right? So we can distinguish between mental and biological well-being, but it does seem like well-being in general tracks both, and it seems to prioritize biological well-being because that's like the continuation of our life, right? In a similar way, we might say that this person is doing pretty well, even though largely they're sad. But if they have their health and they have enough food and they have all their interests met, we would say that they're doing pretty well. Okay, and uh, so we can talk about a thing having interests so long as that thing can be benefited or harmed in virtue of our actions, right? So, for example, a plant, I can spray poison on the plant. That seems to be outside of its interest because the poison will harm the plant, right? It will make it not function the way that it is supposed to function, right? In a similar way, I can benefit the plant by, say, giving it various nutrients and such. Say I put it in a soil with plenty of nitrogen. That will make the plant grow bigger. That would be in the plant's interest because the plant is benefited by that. Okay, so um, Sandler wants to adopt what's called a teleological account of interests, right? So this is the idea is that interests are things that benefit processes, right, that serve a given function, right? So a plant is a teleologically organized entity, right? So this means that the plant undergoes various processes, right? Various functions that serve the continuation of the plant, right? So all life does this. All life has a teleological tinge to it. That means it's a function-oriented tinge or set of things. And so we can say that something has an interest insofar as it's beneficial or harmful to those functions, right? So if one of the functions of a plant is to grow, right? Anything that inhibits the growth of a plant would be um, would be against the plant's interests. That's the idea here. Okay, so here is an argument that plants have interests. And this is important. So before we get into this, it's really important to notice that just because a thing has interests, it does not necessarily follow that it matters morally, right? So this we can differentiate between axiological and ethical claims. Axiological claims are claims about what is good for, what is good, these sorts of things. But it doesn't necessarily follow from that that we have moral duties or moral obligations to that thing, right? So right now, Sandler is just talking about the axiological claim that plants do have interests. So, for example, premise one, an entity has interests if it is possible to benefit and harm it directly. Now, I think this should be an only if it is possible to benefit and harm it directly. Okay. So it's possible to benefit and harm a thing directly only if it is goal oriented. That is, if there is something it is oriented towards accomplishing, right? So, for example, plant growth, right? So we have an interest only exists if we can harm or benefit a thing, right? We can only harm and benefit a thing if the entity is goal directed, right? That is, it has a function that it's trying to accomplish. So cell division, right? Pumping blood, growth, all of these things are function oriented. And so we can harm things that undergo these sorts of activities. Premise three, in plants, goal directedness is accounted for by the explanations for why their parts and processes persist in organisms of that type. And so this is an ideological account of teleology, right? So, so we might say, why does the plant have leaves? The plant has leaves so it can absorb sunlight to create chlorophyll in order to um, make itself continue to exist, right? And so we see the goal orientedness through the parts and processes of the plant, right? Photosynthesis, for example. Okay, and so it follows that the interests of plants can be specified in terms of what resources, conditions, and treatments are conducive to or detrimental to the realization of their goals. For example, survival and reproduction in the ways typical of that organism or type, right? So the idea here is just that plants have interests insofar as they have functional processes, right? And insofar as these processes could go badly or better, right? So we can think about an unhealthy plant, a healthy plant. We can benefit or harm either of those plants, and we can competently call that harming and that benefiting uh, um, um, respecting or disrespecting the plant's interest. That's the idea here. Okay, and so we might wonder, is this a sound argument? So for example, in your paper, if you wanted to summarize and reconstruct this argument and then argue that plants don't in fact have interests, that would be a perfectly plausible thing to do with a paper. And so normally in class we would stop here and think about this argument, and I would field your questions, and also we would try to raise objections to this argument. Um, but one of the nice things is that Sandler does that for us. But before we do that, let's get back to the gap in between axiology and ethics, right? So merely the fact that something has interests does not necessarily demonstrate that that thing, it matters morally, right? So for example, a single bacteria cell, right, might have an interest. It has functions, right? It has functional processes of life and reproduction, right? Uh, and given that it has interests, and so things can go better or worse for it, right? And so we can harm and benefit various bacteria, right? But most people would want to say, well, what the hell? Like it doesn't matter whether or not we kill a bunch of bacteria. In fact, bacteria will often hurt us. So like, why would it be wrong to kill bacteria? He's not saying that. Up until this point, he's just trying to show that plants in fact have interests. Okay. But we might ask, for the sake of argument and for our own curiosity, um, how could we jump across this gap between axiology and ethics, right? So could we actually say, look, a plant has interests, therefore we ought to respect those interests? Could we make that logical jump? So Sandler entertains a couple of principles in order to help us jump over this gap. So first, if something has interest, then the presumption is to consider them unless a good justification is provided for why they ought not be considered. The absence of a good reason not to consider the interest of an entity, including a plant, is sufficient to establish that they are morally considerable and have inherent worth. Okay? Okay, good. So the idea here is that, look, in the absence of reasons that show that the thing doesn't matter, we should just treat it as if it does matter. So this might be closely related to like a precautionary principle. According to precautionary principles, we ought to treat things as if they matter morally when we lack reason to think one way or the other. It's kind of like a play it safe principle. This might be kind of a play it safe principle as well. Number two, if we ought to care about the biological interests of people and sentient non-human animals, independent of how it affects their psychological experiences, then we ought to care about the biological interests of non-conscious organisms, right? So we might say, look, I have an option. Suppose that somebody has cancer, and I can either give them life-saving treatment, and say they don't want it and that it's going to make them undergo a lot of psychological stress, right? Or I can spend that money buying them an all expense paid vacation for like a month, right? So they'll probably have more psychological pleasure on the vacation, but will likely die earlier. Whereas on the other, they'll probably have less psychological pleasure, but their life will probably go on longer. Okay, so this is saying that, look, we ought to care about the human's biological interests in this case, right? We ought not send them to um, an all expense paid vacation when they're going to die in virtue of doing that, right? So, given that we have to prioritize biological interests for humans and maybe animals too, it seems like we ought to also prioritize the biological interest of plants, right? And the idea here is we can't say, look, the only interests that matter are psychological interests when we're often ignoring psychological interest in order to prioritize biological interests. That's the idea here. And then lastly, he says, once a proper biological, ecological, and evolutionary understanding of Homo sapiens and other species is accomplished, we will see that the most reasonable view, the one that best coheres with that well-informed perspective, is that all living things have inherent worth regardless of species membership. So this would be like a biocentrism. The idea is that we enter into a perspective that gives us a special kind of insight, and we see that members of different species are all just pretty much equal, right? So anyway, these are three potential moral principles that can get us from the fact that plants have interests to plants matter morally, right? We need some reason to connect those two, is the idea here. Okay. And so Sandler doesn't commit himself to any of those. Like he said earlier, his goal is an axiological goal and not necessarily an ethical one, right? So he entertains a couple of objections. This is so much fun. If you write your paper like this one, your paper will be the awesomest paper ever. This paper is just so clear and so clean, and the argument is so well laid out. And then the objections are just like objection, reply, objection, reply. This is a super duper paper. Okay, so objection number one, he says the view that plants have equal inherent worth as people is absurd, right? So that tends to be the objection. So your view, Ronald Sandler, is absurd. Since it is clearly permissible to do all sorts of things to a plant, such as own them, that is not permissible to do to people. Look, he says that this is irrelevant, right? Biocentrists are not committed to the claim that plants and people have equal moral worth. And that might be because their interests are like super different, right? So remember, for the Singer stuff, we talked about speciesism and animal and human equality, right? But we're not going to send a pig to college, right? Rather, we're just not going to like slit a pig's throat, right? In the same way we wouldn't slit a human's throat, but we will send the human to college, but not the pig, depending on the interests, right? And so a plant doesn't have an interest in not being owned by someone, right? So the biocentrist is not committed to the claim that we have to do things for the plant that are identical to human beings. Objection two, the view that plants have inherent worth is absurd, since we need to eat them to survive and to kill them to protect ourselves. To this, he responds with, he gets back to moral considerability. The idea is that we have to have at least some reason to kill a plant, right? And most reasons will be plausible candidates for good reasons, right? We can debate about what the good reasons are, right? But like eating is a good reason to kill a plant and eat it. This just seems right, right? But the thing is that you can't just wantonly right? Or without any reason at all, kill plants. That's the idea here. You can't just kill plants because you like it, right? Rather, you need some reason in order for it to be morally permissible. And that reason can be like super weak too, and it might be like depend on the plant too. So like to pluck a piece of grass versus to like cut down like a 200-year-old tree, uh, the reasons will look different between those two different things because one seems more valuable than the other. Okay. Let's see. Objection 3, the view that plants have inherent worth is absurd, since it would imply that every single organism has inherent worth as well, including bacteria. And we've already kind of talked about this briefly. And we cannot avoid relentlessly killing microbes with our immune system. So the idea here is that, look, Sandler, problem with your view. Bacteria matter too, right? Everything that's alive matters. Bacteria must matter too. But we can't help but kill bacteria. So we're always acting morally wrongly. And he wants to say that, look, they do matter, but once again, we often have good reasons for killing bacteria, right? And if we can't help it, then that's just what's going to have to happen, right? So anyway, you can read this later. Let's see here. Another objection is that the view that plants have inherent worth is absurd, since it would imply that all kinds of artifacts, such as wheelbarrows or thermostats, have inherent worth as well. And this is a really interesting objection. So the idea here is that, look, if we say that beings with if we say that beings with functional processes have interests, right? And if we say that given those functional processes, we can benefit or harm that object or that being, right? And if we say that benefiting and harming an entity with functional processes is in some sense morally wrong or morally okay, then we have to also apply that to some artifacts as well, right? So for example, my cell phone has all sorts of processes that it undergoes, right? Functional processes as well, right? For example, calling somebody, downloading an app, deleting an app. These are all different processes that the phone has different mechanisms to help it undergo those things. And we might say that anything that undermines those processes can be properly understood as benefiting it or harming it. So we can benefit and harm the phone as well. So that's the objection. And he just wants to say that he's going to bite the bullet on this one, right? So he's not going to say that it's the biological, right? Rather it's the functional. The functional is key to having an interest. The functional is the key to sort of stepping into rightness or wrongness, right? So he really bites the bullet here, and I think he could also just say that, look, inanimate functional processes, right, like cell phones, we really don't need much reason at all, right? And we might also say that they might have the axiological claim that they do have interests. So, for example, maybe this lamp or this cell phone, maybe it does have an interest, but it doesn't necessarily follow from that the interest matters morally. Okay, objection 5. The idea that plants have inherent worth is absurd, yet again. Since there are so many of them, it is not possible to take all of their individual interests into account. And he says that, look, just because there's a whole lot of something doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, right? So if there were as many humans as there were plants, we would still have to take into consideration all of the interests of those humans, right? And so the idea here is that numbers don't necessarily matter. Okay. And objection six, the view that we should take plant interests into consideration is absurd because it is not possible to know what their interests are, since they cannot communicate them to us or represent them in decision-making processes. Yeah, so the idea here is that a necessary condition for having an interest or taking an interest into consideration is that that being has to express what its interest is, right? So, for example, right, if I were to like karate chop a baby, it would immediately start crying. The crying lets me know that the karate chop made it hurt, right? Made the baby hurt. Okay. And the crying indicates to me that it's in the baby's interest not to be karate chopped, right? Okay. So plants don't work like that though, right? I could just like cut pieces off of a plant and in no way does it tell me anything about what benefits it or what like harms it. Okay. So there's the objection. And the reply here is that, look, we can just kind of figure out what plants' interests are, and it's not necessary that they tell us what those interests are. So, like gardeners and naturalists and farmers and like biologists, like they know how to identify conditions that are better or worse for different plants. That's the idea. So, I mean, when you have a fern in the summer and you're like cutting off all the dead pieces, like you assume that that will benefit the plant, right? And so we act like people who own plants, you know, or people who have gardens or whatever, do things all the time that are intended to benefit the plants and render a better yield or make the plant live longer, right? To water plants is to assume we know that that's good for them. Okay, so it seems like this objection doesn't amount to a very good objection either. Okay, so this is the end of this lecture. Um, I think that this should be one of the last days of the ethics section, and we will very soon be transitioning into the epistemology section. So look out for the new lecture tomorrow on that.